our introductions are done. We're now opening the Hebrew Bible, page 1, starting to read. So that's the first thing we find. We have a creation story. So that's our first task today, is to begin our discussion of these phenomenal, fantastic early stories in the book of Genesis. So all modern Bible scholars agree that Genesis opens with not one, but two creation stories. Now, I need to say right away up front, if you are a traditionalist Jew or a traditionalist Christian committed to the belief in the unitary composition of the Torah, and you believe it was written by one person at one moment under divine inspiration or not, I'll leave that point aside, but it was composed by one mind at one moment in time, then, of course, you will disagree with what I just said and what I'm about to say for the rest of this lecture. You will say, what two accounts? There aren't two accounts. There's one account. I don't understand what you're talking about. It's two chapters. Yeah, chapter 1 and chapter 2. But that's not two accounts. It's just one story told in one way the first time, then told a slightly different way the other time. But clearly they're meant to be complementary. That's a good thing you can do during section. With our section leaders, is to ask, is that a viable way to read Scripture? For many Jews and Christians, the answer is yes. However, we modern Bible scholars are convinced that the answer is no. We modern Bible scholars are convinced that a natural, simple, plain reading of the text, just read what it says and take it seriously for what it says, that we will discover that we seem to have two accounts, wherein the sequence differs and much of the content differs, and to some extent the style differs, leading us to the conclusion that we have two different creation accounts. I will come back to this fundamental problem in a moment. What are these two accounts? First account is Genesis chapter 1, and first a little bit of chapter 2. Whoever divided the chapters was not aware of the modern Bible scholarly division between two accounts, and consequently put the chapter division in the wrong place. So when I say chapter 1, I mean chapter 1 and the first little bit of chapter 2. And then when I say the second account, I mean the rest of chapter 2 and then onward. First creation account, the famous 7 days of creation, climaxing in the seventh day, which is the Sabbath. That's creation story number 1. Creation story number 2 is the climaxing in the creation of Eve, the story of Adam, Eve, and the apple. It wasn't really an apple, right? It was just a fruit. Right. Adam, Eve, the apple, the snake, and the Garden of Eden. And then the story continues from there. That's story number 2. As I'll discuss on Wednesday, that story, in which Adam and Eve are expelled from the Garden of Eden, is the first of a series of stories in these early chapters of Genesis, in which humanity rebels against God, rejects the divine mandate, or does something evil in the sight of God, and then consequences follow. We have a series of at least 4 of such episodes in these early chapters of Genesis. But we'll come back to that on Wednesday. So, let's begin. We have then not one, but 2 creation stories. Creation stories you find all over the world. You take your comparative mythology class, you'll find every peoples from the Aleuts to the Zulus, and everybody in between, everybody has creation stories. Who doesn't have creation stories? Right. So there's nothing unusual in the Israelites also having not one, but 2 creation stories. Generally speaking, though, these creation stories, if you do a little comparative mythology, involve either copulation or battle. Where does the world come from? Either we have these 2 gods, God and goddess, with some kind of divine copulation. After all, that's how we know how reproduction occurs. So, presumably, the world itself is born of the fruit of such a standard kind of act of production and reproduction. So the gods are either copulating, or the gods are having a massive battle. There are dragons and massive fights between different teams of gods, and then the world emerges somehow out of the corpses of the losers, the winners, whatever. A whole set of variations. So copulation and battling. Class. Genesis chapter 1, Genesis chapter 2. Is there any divine copulation going on? No. Is there any divine battling going on? No. These two stories, although they're different from each other, are united in the fact that they are non-mythological. Right? They don't involve a story of the god. The gods are not doing anything except for the act of creation itself. But the Hebrew Bible preserves for us, it seems, relics, if that's the right word, or allusions to creation stories in which we do seem to have God, the true God, the one and only universal God, that God, not to be confused with other gods, where that God is engaged, indeed, not in copulation, but in battle. That the act of creation, it seems, in these passages strewn hither and thither in Scripture, we seem to have allusions to battle scenes of God taking on great sea monsters. And I gave you a bunch of these passages to look at, probably more than I should have. So I just want to look together with you at a couple of these, and also to learn how to teach you, to make sure we all know how to find our way in Scripture. So let's look at Isaiah 51:9. I'll translate here. That will be different from that one because I'm reading the Hebrew. So, arise, gird your strength, the arm of the Lord. Arise as you were in days of old, in generations of time, of eternal time. You are the one who, how's it translated there? Dug out, excavated, chopped. How does it say? Rahab. What's the verb? That's English? Hacked. Hacked is good. Right. You are the one who hacked Rahab, who pierced through or destroyed Tanin, dragon. Right? The prophet is singing of God's divine might. Right? God's arm is so powerful that in times of yore, God destroyed, hacked, chopped, brutalized Rahab, and not to mention Rahab, but also Tanin in the next verse. And you are the one, you, second person feminine, addressing the arm of the Lord. You are the one who dried up Yam. Yam is the Hebrew word for sea. You dried up sea, right? The waters of the great deep. Tahom. Remember the word tahom. The abyss. We'll see that word in Genesis chapter 1 in just a moment. You are the one who dried up Yam, the waters of the great deep, who did something to the depths of the water, the path by which those who are redeemed will pass. What is that talking about? Moses. Presumably the Exodus story. Right? That the Exodus story, which if you don't know what this is, that's fine. We'll get there in a couple of weeks. The climax of the Exodus story, the Israelites leave the land of Egypt, which they had been enslaved. They passed through the waters, and God had dried up the sea before them so they could pass through on dry land. When they get to the other side, the waters return and destroy their enemies. Okay, and similarly then the prophet goes on to say, and those redeemed of the Lord shall return, shall come to Zion with singing. What is Zion? Zion is Jerusalem. Zion is the poetic name for Jerusalem. Right? The poets don't like the word Jerusalem, they like the word Zion. They shall return to Zion in singing and with the great rejoicing on their heads. Rejoicing and rejoicing and rejoicing. Okay. So what do we see in this passage? So the passage is singing about the great power of God, that God can hack down, strike down Rahab, Tanin, dragon, can dry up the sea. Right? God is in control of these elements, just as God did this of old. Similarly, and God did it for those redeemed from Egypt, so too understood the passage is saying, God will do it for those who are to return to Jerusalem, to Zion. This being written in the exilic period. I can mention that word casually, right? When is the exilic period? Exilic period. When is that? 587. Good. 587 BCE is the exile. What? Timeline. Turn back to your timeline. That's why we gave you a timeline. Lecture 2. You have a timeline. All right, it will sink in, but you got to work with me here on this. Right, the exilic period at 587 BC, the Israelites are exiled to, the Judeans are exiled to Babylon. Then they return from Babylon and rebuild the Second Temple in the late 6th century BCE. And we think Isaiah, the author of this chapter, of chapter 51 of Isaiah, is not the Isaiah of the 8th century BCE. We think he's an anonymous prophet who's living during the exilic period, perhaps even in the Persian period. Well, another one to remember. Persian period. End of the 6th century, 5th century BCE. After the Babylonians come the Persians. We think he's alive in the Persian period. Maybe. Actually, that's debated. Either Babylonian or Persian period. Anyway, why am I telling you all this? Because here we have the prophet Isaiah singing of the great power of God. That God can take on Rahab, take on dragon, take on sea, just as God did so of old and won. Similarly, the prophet is suggesting God can take on Israel's depressed situation now and bring about redemption for the Judeans. Right? That's the meaning of this passage. So, class, who are these mysterious Rahab, dragon, and sea that God took on in battle and beat? Who are they? Where are they? Answer, we don't know. Except that Scripture has like a dozen of these scriptural references scattered hither and thither. I gave you a bunch on your syllabus to show that when biblical authors wax poetic, wax ecstatic about praising divine power, they often trot out Rahab. What is the word Rahab? I don't know. Seems to be some kind of monster. Primordial monster destroyed by the power of God in creation eons ago, as the prophet says. So, back to our lecture notes. So I won't go through all the passages, but hopefully you can at least look at a bunch of them and see. What they all have in common, they all are in the prophetic books or the book of Job. These are books of high poetry. So, what do we make of this class? Do we conclude from this that parallel to Genesis 1 and 2, there were circulating other creation accounts in ancient Israel? Creation accounts that in fact are bloody stories of conquest and battle in which God takes on these monsters, beats them, destroys them, hacks them, and creates the world? Shall we conclude that, class? Or shall we say, hey, give me a break. It's a poet. It's poetry. He'll write all kinds of stuff. He's not writing a theological treatise. He's not writing a theological tractate on the creation of the world, right? Or the origins of evil, or any such things. Give me a break. Yeah, he knows that there are stories out there. Every literate person knows there are stories out there. And the prophet, of course, alludes to them for his prophetic imagination or imagining of God and divine power. How to actualize that in speech. One way is to poetry. God hacked Rahab. Do I believe that God really hacked Rahab? Of course not. It's poetry. Give me a break. Oh, good. Yes, Matt.
How do we know that Rahab and the dragon are not names to refer to someone like Satan?
Good question. Well, if you are a cosmic dualist, right, in which you are convinced that the reason this world is such a lousy place is because it's under the control of demons, elements, powers, and the rest, all trotted out by Paul in various passages, right? If you believe that, then you might say, aha, I know who Rahab and Tanin and Yam are. They are old man Satan dressed up in different guises, right? Locked in this eternal cosmic struggle with God, the principle of good, the principle of justice. And it's very possible there is some kind of connection, right? That through subterranean memory, these Rahab and monsters, the opponents of God in the act of creation, maybe do feed in centuries later into a cosmic dualist view of the world. I don't exclude that. However, I think in terms of ancient Israelite theology, I think the burden of proof would be upon you to demonstrate that there is a connection between these views, and I don't think you'll find it. I don't think you'll find evidence for it. So it's not impossible, nothing's impossible, but it's not likely in the absence of evidence. The cosmic dualist view of the world, in which this world is seen to be the province of the domain of evil forces, such that we need to escape and to make sure our allegiance is with the good God, the powers of light, the powers of truth, etc. That view you find in ancient Judaism, but you got to wait a while. It's probably the last centuries BCE, just before the emergence of Christianity in the first century CE, that you will find that view attested very clearly in Jewish texts. Probably because the standard view of reward and punishment has been exhausted. The standard view of divine control of the world, which I spoke about last time, right? That view simply ran out of steam. It clearly is not working. And all the tweaking you can do, at the end of the day, it doesn't work. That takes, that's down the road a piece still. But you have to, but it's an interesting thing to think about, these mysterious passages about Rahab and Tanin, who take on God in battle and lose.
Do we know anything about the historical lives of the prophets?
There is about historical lives of the prophets, only insofar as they tell us. We'll talk about prophets in several weeks down the road. So this mysterious anonymous prophet, the author of Isaiah chapter 51, we modern scholars say he's not the same as the first Isaiah. The author of Isaiah chapter 1 through 39 is not the same as the author of chapter 40 through 66. We know that because we modern scholars are very smart and have convinced ourselves of this fact. But having said that, we don't have a name, we don't have a biography, we don't have a social setting, we don't have nothing. We don't know anything. Later, Jews and Christians will feel a lacuna in the lives of the prophets, and there is a book that was written in the Byzantine times called Lives of the Prophets, in which they make up all kinds of great stories and burial places for the prophets, because it seems unseemly we have these great men of God, and yet we don't know anything about them. But they don't know anything about 2nd Isaiah. That's something which the Byzantine book doesn't know. In brief, the answer is no, unless they tell us. So, Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 don't have that exciting story of God taking on Rahab and dragon and sea and beating them to bits, chopping them to bits, or drying them up, or whatever. We have instead a very different set of accounts. But even here, if we look carefully, we can perhaps see that the author is aware of these other accounts, or is writing with deliberate opposition to those accounts. So everybody points to those mysterious opening verses of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, which is traditionally translated, "In the beginning God created heaven and earth." But all modern translations, I didn't check all, I checked a bunch, right? There's general consensus among modern Bible scholars that that's an incorrect translation. It should be understood to be "in the beginning, comma, when God created da 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 da, then God da 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 da." So it's a long, complicated sentence rather than a short, simple sentence. "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth." That's probably not the way to translate the opening verse. Anyway, my point here is that chapter 1, so verse 1 is in the beginning, or when God began to create heaven and earth, comma. Now comes verse 2. "And the earth was tohu and bohu." I don't know, translate that. "The earth was tohu and bohu, and there was darkness upon the deep." Tahom, the same word Isaiah used, we read a moment ago in chapter 51 about Rahab. The same word, tahom. "And the darkness was over the deep, and the wind," or the Spirit of the Lord, "was fluttering upon the water." To which my only response can only be, what? What are all these things, and where did they come from? This will spawn enormous speculation by later Jews and Christians, that we have a creation, but the creation, there's stuff there already. There is the land, there is darkness, there is the abyss, there is the wind or Spirit of the Lord, and then there is this water. What is all that stuff? Where does it come from? I don't know. But I do know that ancient Jews and Christians were much intrigued by verse 2, understanding where these things come from. So the reference, though, to the waters and to Tahom Reminds me of those things we just read about God taking on the waters and God taking on the deep. Similarly, chapter 1, verse 21, we have dragons are mentioned on the fifth day of creation, right? It says God creating all the fish, fifth day the fish, and including it says, Vayivra Elohim et hataninim hagedolim, and God created the mighty dragons. Why do scriptures single that out? Probably because the author wants you to know, I know about those stories about those dragons, and trust me, they don't got any content. They're nothing. God created the dragons like everything else. Period. Then we have this mysterious plural in Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 that already was asked about. What's going on there? Is this a relic of, again, some mythological account of many gods at work? Or what? The standard explanation is, this is, as I've already mentioned, this is God talking to his royal court. No king does anything all by himself. Kings always have officers and ministers galore. So similarly, God, at the climax of creation, Genesis chapter 1, right, is about to create Adam. So God doesn't do it by himself. God has assistants, an army of assistants, like any king, worthy of his name. So it's also not mythological. Maybe. Later Jews and Christians will say this is God talking to the angels. It's a small problem with that. Where are the angels? Where do they come from? When are they created? Answer, they're not. They're omitted by Genesis chapter 1 and 2. There are no angels being created. So how does God create Adam with angels? There aren't any angels yet. They have to posit that the angels come from somewhere else. But then you're in trouble. So I'm not sure what to do. Maybe this is also a relic of some more complicated mythological account. When we turn to Genesis chapter 2, we don't really have mythology here. We'll talk about that in a second. We seem to have, as Kugel says, folklore relics. With magic trees and talking snakes. It sounds like folklore to me, more so than, let's say, the mythology. But we'll go back to that snake, if not today, then next time. A crucial point in both Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, God is by himself. Except for chapter 1, verse 26, that mysterious plural, God is acting entirely on his own in both accounts. In the first account, the name used for God is Elohim, which seems to be a plural form, and indeed, in some passages in Scripture, Elohim, it governs a plural verb, and seems to be the translation, we would translate that as gods in some passages. But in most passages, in fact the vast majority, Elohim, even though it looks like a plural noun, governs a singular verb. It's a singular thing. It's a singular thing, but it's also a masculine thing. The verb that Elohim governs is always masculine. Small footnote. In English, you can't tell gender by a verb. English is relatively ungendered language, which explains why you can have egalitarian theology in English. If you're thinking in Hebrew, it's very hard to have egalitarian theology because Hebrew is a highly gendered language. Nouns, verbs, everything is gendered. It's either masculine or feminine. There's no neuter in Hebrew either, as in some languages. Like Greek has masculine, feminine, and neuter. Hebrew only has masculine and feminine. Everything's either masculine or feminine. It's all binary. Everything is gendered. So the noun for God is not only a singular noun, it's also a masculine noun. It raises the interesting question, if God is masculine from the point of view of grammar, is God also male? And if God is male, then of course, the next question is, well, where is the female? So people scour the scriptures looking for evidence that once upon a time the ancient Israelites thought that God had a female consort. The evidence for that, as you might suspect, is disputed. tricky, mysterious, hard to interpret. We have to look outside the Bible for references, notably some inscriptions, which maybe, as one book put it, God has a wife. The important point is in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, God is masculine, God is singular, but there is no feminine deity consort anywhere in sight, nor are there any other gods anywhere in sight. That's what we mean when we say this account is non-mythological. There are no stories about this God, he just is. Okay, this is by way of a little background. Yes, Matt.
Question from the anonymous Jewel.
Good.
You've used the words folklore relic and mythological relic. Is there a difference?
Yes, I'm using them differently. I guess I should take Mythology 101 to work out my theoretical basis for this distinction, which I never did. But by mythology, I mean specifically stories about the gods. When we tell mythology, then, Zeus and Apollo one day did X. Right? Marduk one day did Y. There was a great battle between Ge and Saturn. You have stories about the gods. That's typically what I mean by mythology. Ancient Israel has no mythology. Or if it is, it's lost. Except for these fragments like God takes on Rahab. God takes on the sea. And there's a battle. Well, that's a story about God. Otherwise, all the stories about God in the Israelite scriptures, the Hebrew Bible, are God acting with humans, judging, talking, giving laws, revelation, and the rest. But God himself has no story. There's no birth, there's no death, there are no battle scenes, no nothing. I call that mythology. Folklore are all kinds of motifs we see typically in stories from nations throughout the world, again, from the Aleuts to the Zulus, everybody in between. We have all kinds of interesting stories about, remarkable stories about nature. So in Genesis chapter 2 and 3, we have these mysterious trees in the Garden of Eden, these magic trees. We have a talking snake. These are typical motifs of folklore. The issue here is not true and false. Don't confuse this. That's not the category. I'm not saying mythology is a way of saying something is false. No, I'm not saying that at all. It's not what we mean. But mythology are sacred stories about the gods. That's mythology. Yes, sir.
Is there any concept of the royal we in Israel this time?
Well, yeah, that's how people try to get also explain chapter 1, verse 26. God is getting very royal, first person plurally, when he's creating Adam. Everything else he can do without the first person plural. But he gets to Adam, the climax of the creative process, God now shifts to the royal we. Does this ancient Hebrew have a royal we? Not really. But, well, yeah, it does. Chapter 1, verse 26 of Genesis. It's right there. I don't know. I don't think so. But interpreters have suggested that too. Good. All right, let's do other questions. Okay, let's do a little compare and contrast these two creation accounts, just so we can see if they in fact are, well, complementary, different, contradictory, whatever word we think is appropriate. Chapter 1, first creation account, attributed by modern Bible scholars to this mysterious entity called P. And we'll talk more about that. God creates the world through speech. The main verb uses speech. God says, let something be, and lo and behold, it is. So the creative power of God is manifest in divine speech. That's Genesis chapter 1. Another interesting motif in Genesis chapter 1 is separation. The world is chaos, and God imposes order by separating that which is mumble-jumbled together and needs to be separated to make distinct. God makes distinct what previously is indistinct. That's a motif we see especially in the early days of creation, separating light from dark, separating the waters above from the waters below. These are acts of separation. Last and not least, in chapter 1, we have a mysterious verb, bara in Hebrew. This verb appears elsewhere in Scripture. But wherever this verb appears, God is always the subject. You and I don't do bara. That's God. God does bara. You and I do all kinds of other things. We can chop, cut, fashion, sand, file, drill. We can do all kinds of verbs, right? But we don't do bara. Only God does bara. Put it together, chapter 1 seems to have a rather, sometimes we call it a philosophical view of God, which the act of creation clearly is not akin to the act that you and I take a block of wood and make something out of it. Nothing like that at all. It's completely different. Whereas chapter 2 is very much the divine craftsman, the divine carpenter, the divine carver, right? God takes, with the creation of Adam, he takes some mud, puts it together, blows air into it, and poof, the creature comes alive. Which is it seems completely different in conception from what we have in chapter 1. We call chapter 1 philosophical, abstract. Chapter 2 is very much God as divine carpenter, the divine artisan, right? Putting the world together. There's no creation through speech. There's no mysterious verb bara, and there's none of this philosophical stuff. Is this a contradiction, class? No, it's not a contradiction. Are they different? Yes, they're different. The God of chapter 2, whom we attribute to this mysterious source called J, and we'll come back to these things many times, is anthropomorphic. I said he's a divine carpenter. Presumably he walks and talks. He does things. I guess he has hands and arms. That's how he makes things. Right? He is anthropopathic. He has the same emotions as humans, as we'll discover in subsequent chapters. This God gets angry. This God can be happy. It's hard to imagine the God of chapter 1 being angry. I'm not sure what to imagine that God of chapter 1. It's hard to imagine what that God is. Whereas in chapter 2, this God is like a human, only infinitely more powerful. But fundamentally, a humanoid, or anthropomorphic, anthropopathic in chapter 2. First creation story. The great climax is the Sabbath. It ends with 6 days of creation, and God rests on the 7th. Presumably, as Kugel talks about this, presumably the implied message here is that maybe you too should observe the Sabbath. Since God sanctified the day and made it holy, then I guess it's a good thing that you too should rest on the 7th day. So that seems to be the, quote, point of the first creation story, an endorsement of the Sabbath day. And indeed we find that in the 10 Commandments, in Exodus chapter 20. Right? 7 days you shall labor, 6 days you shall labor, and the 7th day you shall rest, because the Lord your God created the world. That seems to be the theory of Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 2, the second account, has no reference to the Sabbath at all. It seems to have as its point not the endorsement of the Sabbath, but it's an etiological tale, or etiology. What is etiology? This. Right. Etiology is a story, logos, theory, doctrine, rationale, of etios. Etios in Greek means, or itia in Greek means responsibility. An etiological tale is a tale that explains to you why things are the way they are. That's an etiology, etiological tale. It explains the origins of things, why things are the way they are. So, the story in chapter 2, which leads into the story of chapter 3, the expulsion from the garden, which we'll talk about more next time, there's a series of explanations. Why is it so hard to make a living? Why is childbirth for women so difficult? Why are women subservient to their husbands? That's written by someone who thinks women are subservient to their husbands. Why snakes don't have feet? Why humans wear clothes? Why men desire women? Well, these are interesting questions. Well, this story in chapter 3, which we'll talk about next time, right, which is in turn a continuation of the story in chapter 2, right, explains all these things to you, these mysteries of the world. Why are things this way? Why aren't things some other way? How come animals give birth with so little pain and suffering? How come animals seem to support themselves without working so hard? They don't have to get undergraduate degrees and then graduate degrees and then, spend internships and fellowships galore. They just go out and eat. How come? Why is it so much more difficult for us? Well, the story explains it. We'll come back to it. Don't worry, we'll come back to this. So this is an etiological tale. Chapter 1 has no etiologies except insofar as the Sabbath. Chapter 2 explains all kinds of things about the way the world is. Last but not least, the major contrast, of course, is where we put Adam. First man, primordial human. Right. Where is Adam? How do we understand who or what Adam is? In the first creation story, chapter 1, Adam comes on day 6. Right? This is the end point. Right? All of creation is pointing towards this moment. Right? Of God creating humans. And humans, of course, are said to be created in the image of God. Whatever that means exactly, endlessly disputed by interpreters. What exactly does that mean? The key point, though, is humans come at the climax of creation in the image of God, unlike all other creatures that God has created. Only humans are in the image of God. This represents the climactic endpoint of the creative process, followed by the Sabbath. In chapter 2, we have no reference to image of God. And Adam, it seems, if we read the sequence straight along, seems to be created at the very beginning. And after God creates Adam, then God creates all kinds of other creatures, brings them to Adam. Adam gives them names. So again, another etiological tale. Where do these names come from? Answer, they come from Adam. Right? And then Adam tries them all out and sees that none of them is a suitable companion. That's when God gets the bright idea. Okay, I guess I'll have to create something new, and I'll create woman. That's where women come from. Right? So the first woman comes out of Adam, even though all subsequent human beings come out of woman. Right? But the first woman herself comes out of Adam. That's chapter 2. Chapter 1 has none of that. Chapter 1 instead has, on this gender question, an extraordinarily cryptic and difficult verse, where it says that God created Adam in his image. In the image of God, he created them. So now I'm completely confused. Adam, one person, two persons, or as some ancient interpreters thought, this was a hermaphroditic person. A hermaphrodite, right? Half male, half female, or somehow male, female blended together, which subsequently gets separated. Remember separation? Genesis chapter 1, separation. So it's not an absurd rendering, an absurd possibility. But the key point here is that in chapter 1, Adam emerges as human, climax at the end of creation, male and female. Chapter 2, Adam is male. Adam looks around, sees there's no suitable companion for himself, and then God creates woman, Eve, out of Adam. Put it together. Are these contradictory accounts? Well, yeah, if you want to push this pretty hard, I would say we have a contradiction here. Is Adam at the beginning, Adam at the end? Is Adam male and female, or is Adam male only? Right? Is Adam the image of God or not? So these seems to be inconsistent accounts. Have no fear. Our ancient Jewish and Christian readers found ways to reconcile all this, but they have to labor very hard. Surely, that's an important word for Shaye Cohen. Surely means I'm not sure at all. Surely means I'm making it up. Surely means I have no evidence at all. But I'm covering my nakedness by saying surely. Surely, it is much simpler to say we have two parallel, separate accounts which are simply inconsistent with each other. Okay, last big point. Here I'm going to end with a point with which I'll begin on Wednesday. Why does the Torah begin with this material, these stories? The creation story of chapter 1, the creation story of chapter 2, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, chapter 3, Cain and Abel, chapter 4. right? As we move ahead, then genealogies, and then the flood story in chapter 5 and 6, and so on. Moving ahead into the flood, chapter 6, 7. These are not simply told as stories because they're great stories. You know, from the point of view of stories, these are great stories. No, the point of that is to emphasize that there is a God, and if there is a God, it means the Bible is saying there is also a moral order, which is one of the big points of the Hebrew Scriptures as a whole. The creation story serves not simply to glorify divine power, which it does, not simply to explain how things are the way they are, which it does, but also helps to explain that there is a demand for righteousness. The world is not a chaotic assemblage of this and that. Rather, there is a moral order which is built into the cosmos, which is one of the big points of the Hebrew Scriptures. And when the other places in the Bible allude to creation, this is almost always the point which we are trying to make. The fact that God is a creator God and that the world is his creation means that the world stands in some moral relationship with God. Okay, my time's really up. I will pick up on this point on Wednesday, and we'll continue to look at the other stories, opening stories in the book of Genesis.